Thank you for having me. It's the first time I've presented at a conference, so please be gentle. What I'm presenting today, it's on the one hand, it's kind of partly derived. Yeah, that's normal. On the one hand, this is kind of partly derived, and is sort of an offshoot from sort of like a chapter draft that I'm working on. So it's very much a work in progress. So again, please be gentle. Can we get the slide off as well, please? Thank you. Also, I apologise in advance. It might get quite loud, but I'll man the volume control just in case. Yeah, so operating on the fringes of the Japanese film industry for almost his entire career, independent filmmaker Tsukamoto Shinya is perhaps best known for his uncompromising freneticism and preoccupation with the corporeal. However, Tsukamoto's engagement with intermedial filmmaking and editing practices and how these accentuate his auteurist qualities is yet to be fully considered. Drawing on Laura Mulvey's conception of the uncanny in response to cinema's potential to confuse animate and inanimate, as well as Tsukamoto's own under-discussed background in experimental street theatre and television advertising production, this presentation seeks to examine Tsukamoto's unique use of stop-motion photography within his signature self-produced feature, Tetsuo the Iron Man. I intend to show that these hyperbolic sequences not only instill an uncanniness in their live-action subjects, who are rendered inanimate then reanimated to form staccato cyborg characters, but also a medial uncanny that simultaneously emulates and subverts the qualities of a vast range of media. Tetsuo features two characters, played by Taguchi Tomoro and Tsukamoto himself, that find themselves transforming into mechanized humanoids after metallic samples assimilate with their DNA. Scrap metal erupts from under the flesh, and appendages mutate into various cybernetic weaponry. The style of the film is one where the mechanical process of the filmic image is also brought to the surface, and this is most visible during the film's many sequences of live-action, stop-motion photography, which are used to instigate transformation and allow these characters to engage in superhuman travel and hyperbolic combat. That was Tsukamoto there. Steeped in transnational science fiction and horror genre iconographies, many Western film journalists and scholars have previously chosen to unravel the audiovisual complexities of Tetsuo via a critical framework of intertextuality, where they revel in diagnosing the various artifacts that Tsukamoto appears to be quoting. Ian Conrich has pointed out how films such as James Cameron's The Terminator, Paul Verhoeven's RoboCop, as well as the work of filmmakers David Cronenberg, Alejandro Jodorowsky, Norman McLaren and Sam Raimi, among others, was a prominent aspect of the reviews of Tetsuo upon its release outside Japan. And Tsukamoto himself has not exactly been shy when talking about the films that have inspired him, stating at one point that he considers Ridley Scott's Blade Runner and Cronenberg's Videodrome as the parents of Tetsuo. However, an intertextual approach can only take us so far in understanding the dynamic practice on display in Tetsuo, as, to borrow the terminology of Bolter and Grusin, Tsukamoto's style frequently generates friction between the immediate and hypermediate, realised via heightened acting and blocking, frenetic camera work, rigorous editing, and propulsive music. As has been suggested by Werner Wolf, an intermedial framework serves as a logical continuation to the intertextual, exploring more broadly the relationship between the signifiers of varying types of media and how their usage could challenge what could be described as medial specificity. Along similar lines to Bolter and Grusin, Agnes Patho has suggested two possible templates for reading cinematic intermediality. The first is a sensual mode that invites the viewer to be involved at the proximity of entangled synesthetic sensations, where one intuitively absorbs the kaleidoscopic impressions generated through medial signifiers. The second is a more hands-on structural mode, whereby the cinematic flow of images are broken down into their media components, leading to a shattering of the world into pieces of media representations. So I'd like to propose that Tsukamoto's distinctive filmmaking approach with Tetsuo is just as potent a site for both sensual and structural medial cross-pollination as it is for intertextual comparison, while also demonstrating the potential ramifications of such fusions and how these can cause tensions between conceptions of the rational and the uncanny within media. The potential for the intermedial discussion surrounding Tsukamoto's film work becomes especially palpable if one takes into account his aforementioned creative background in experimental street theatre and television advertising. After self-producing a number of 8mm films as a teenager throughout the 1970s, Tsukamoto soon abandoned filmmaking altogether as his attention drew increasingly towards the stage, forming two theatre troupes. The first was Yumimaru, meaning Dream Circle, and later he founded Kaiju Theatre, or Sea Monster Theatre, whose stage productions were typically devised within a small, purpose-built tent fashioned by the troupe members themselves. Meanwhile, Tsukamoto's work for the advertising company Ide Production saw him produce commercials for items such as Casio keyboards, fur coats, and Nikon cameras. His interest in filmmaking subsequently rekindled, and with the help of his Kaiju Theatre troupe, produced two 8mm films in quick succession. These films that followed his activity in Kaiju Theatre and Ide Production are markedly different from those 8mm films produced before, most notably due to their experimentations with live-action stop-motion hybridity, liberating Tsukamoto from the temporal and spatial constraints of intimate stage performance, as well as from the self-described one-scene, one-cut approach of his earlier filmmaking attempts. These innovations would continue to be utilised in Tetsuo, which was once again produced by the same core group of personnel from Tsukamoto's former theatre troupe. As such, Tetsuo's production was also characterised by a strong degree of spontaneity, with many scenes and sequences being performed in a single take, leading to theatrical exaggeration. However, Tsukamoto's main cinematic concern for Tetsuo was creating what he has referred to as a sensuous image that showed the relationship between metal materiality and the flesh. So I want to consider Tsukamoto's usage of kind of crude stop-motion photography in more detail, as its introduction into Tsukamoto's filmmaking is essential when discussing the potential existence of what I termed earlier as the medial uncanny. Tsukamoto's method of live-action stop-motion hybridization instantly aligns itself with the animation technique known as pixelation, where live actors are used as the subject for animation as though living puppets. Rudimentary use of pixelation can be traced all the way back to the earliest years of cinema and animation, one example being the short Spanish silent comedy The Electric Hotel, where guests seem to be pampered by automated grooming appliances. But perhaps the permutation of pixelation that resembles Tsukamoto's work the closest lies in the films of the aforementioned Norman McLaren, whose most famous work, Neighbours, prefigures the mechanised human locomotions and sound effects that would be amplified considerably in Tetsuo. Tsukamoto's iteration, however, differs from that of McLaren in that many of his sequences of pixelation are executed with a non-fixed camera. So, an actor strikes a pose on the street. A single frame is then taken of them. They move forward a little and repose, but crucially, the camera position is also moved and another single frame is then taken. The process is repeated over and over, resulting in the visual effect where the character appears to glide or surf along the surface of the road, with both the camera and audience along for the ride. It should be acknowledged that this method of animation would have just as likely been born from logistical necessity as it was from creative experimentation, as the filmmaking technologies required to achieve these effects professionally would have been way beyond Tsukamoto's initial investment of 5 million yen, which is around 42,000 euros in today's money. However, this do-it-yourself approach, the taking of still photographic frames and arranging them sequentially as a means of reanimating their subjects, yields an important side effect. Stephen T. Brown has noted that Tsukamoto's method of live-action stop-motion hybridity produces an effect of the uncanny by blurring the boundaries between the animate and inanimate. In Death 24 Times a Second, Laura Mulvey ruminates on the photograph's role both as mechanised imprint that preserves life after death and its innate ability to conflate the two. It is at this moment, according to Mulvey, that a sense of the uncanny presents itself, with Mulvey describing the phenomena as often experienced as a collapse of rationality and as a property of the human mind and its uncertainties. So unlike the more expressive movements in McLaren's animations, Tsukamoto's method of pixelation in many instances results in the actors barely moving beyond set poses, appearing stilted and tableau-like. Minor fluctuations of said positions notwithstanding, these sequences are orchestrated so that their live, animate subjects appear as inanimate as possible. As such, these sequences represent a tactile, production-centric extension to the film's central theme of flesh merging with metal. A specificity between animate and inanimate, organic and inorganic, living and non-living, and perhaps even form and content are continually challenged and blurred as human bodies are turned rigid and metal materials are rendered pliant and flexible. The rapidly changing non-fixed camera of these particular sequences also creates a further subversion between subject and environment, as the actors often find themselves confined to a particular spot within the frame, while the surrounding urban and industrial space, consisting of buildings, lampposts, fences, etc., competes for the eye's attention as it appears more alive than the human subjects of a given shot. This stands in sharp contrast to mainstream usage of stop-motion animation, which during the 1980s was still the preferred method for filmmakers intending to bring non-living or fantastical characters to life. And various techniques were pioneered in order to deliver a sense of realism in the way that these subjects moved. Films such as RoboCop, which is cited earlier by Conrich as a point of comparison in critics' reviews of Tetsuo, used a technique known as go motion to animate the imposing, malfunctioning enforcement droid Ed 209. Developed by visual effects artists Phil Tippett and John Berg, go motion has been described as a technique to reduce the problem of strobing, a common problem inherent in stop-motion animation, by using computer-controlled motors to blur the motion of the manually animated models during photography of individual frames in film. Tippett and Berg brought stop-motion animation to a new level of realism. So the purpose of the motion blur during the photographing of a frame then was to generate the appearance of natural fluidity by effectively creating movement between movement. Tetsuo, by contrast, makes absolutely no attempt to create believable motion, seeming more content to play with cinema's mechanistic division of human movement into hidden micro-gestures lasting a 24th of a second each, and making said gestures plainly visible to the viewer. So rather than the North American genre films mentioned by Conrich earlier, perhaps Tetsuo's intentions are better compared with some of the avant-garde film experiments taking place in Europe during the latter half of the 1980s. For instance, Piccolo Film di Composto by the Italian filmmaker and photographer Paolo Gioli reanimates the human subjects from the chronophotography of Edward Muybridge, whose work originally set out to break down complex locomotion and arrange them in sequential cells for scientific study. Another Gioli experiment, Quando l'occhio trema, reworks material from Luis Buñuel's Un chien andalou to manipulate cinematic human movement, in this case the flickering eye. Similar film manipulations were also performed by the Viennese artist Martin Arnold, whose very first work, Pièce touchée, takes a short excerpt from the 1950s Hollywood film The Human Jungle and elongates, reverses and repeats it to obsessively scrutinise the hidden robotisation of the human form as it is caught on camera. Of Pièce touchée, Mulvey has observed that the repetition of frames in series is similar to the effect of proto-cinematic flicker films, and that the repeated frames that elongate each movement and gesture assert the presence of film strip. So it could be said that the work of both Gioli and Arnold during this period not only instills a sense of the uncanny in the human figures depicted in these intensively remediated pre-existing works, but that such remediation also instills a sense of the uncanny in the medium itself, as the methods employed by these artists severely corrupt their original context, both physical and temporal, as well as what could be referred to as the rationale of the medium in question. Can, for example, the stuttering discontinuity of Pièce touchée or the freshly reanimated continuity of Piccolo Film di Composto be considered artefacts of cinema and chronophotography respectively? Or, to paraphrase an earlier quote from Mulvey, could it be said that a collapse of rationality galvanised by such manipulation is in effect, creating an artefact that once emulates or embraces certain fundamental medial signifiers, while at the same time eluding or subverting others, and thus could perhaps be described as an instance of medial uncanniness? Although Tetsuo is unique to these examples in that it is not a direct manipulation of a pre-existing text, it could be said that a medial uncanniness is generated in the way that these sequences of non-fixed pixelation are executed, playfully oscillating between the rationale that respectively characterises cinema, animation and photography. Tsukamoto arranges photographic frames in a manner that resembles continuous motion, but the truth, however, is that this sense of continuity is merely an uncanny emulation, even though cinema by its very nature is made up of a rapid succession of still images. Film editor Walter Murch offers an interesting distinction concerning moving image continuity and the context that we, as the viewer, subconsciously place upon it. He states that each frame in cinema is a displacement from the previous one. It's just that in a continuous shot, the space-time displacement from frame to frame is small enough for the audience to see it as motion within context, rather than as 24 different contexts per second. Murch then goes on to say that, on the other hand, when the visual displacement is great enough, as at the moment of the cut, we are forced to re-evaluate the new image as a different context. So I'd like to argue, or like to suggest rather, that Tsukamoto's do-it-yourself pixelation technique, where motion is created through rigorous cutting, exists between these states, constituting motion resembling context, as the displacement between his similar yet autonomous snapshot images is perhaps too great to be truly considered within context, but not so much that it qualifies as a different context. Again, Tsukamoto's limited resources, coupled with the fact that he was working predominantly in urban Tokyo streets as opposed to a dedicated studio space, did not afford him the luxury or opportunity to create sufficiently discrete motion displacements or create movement between movement, as was the case with Phil Tippett and Go Motion. In animation terms, Tsukamoto's sequences could be said to be made up exclusively of key frames, i.e. the defining moments animators use to map out particular movements, and without what are referred to as the in-betweens that fill the gaps in space and time to seamlessly join them together. The results then are sequences that appear so successive that they corrupt the frozen temporality of photography, but so staccato that they challenge the continuous fluidity of motion that sets cinema apart from its ancestor medium. This fixation with medial heritage chimes with the second clause of Stephen T. Brown's earlier quote, where he also notes that Tsukamoto's stop-motion technique exposes the very origin of cinema. I would like to add to this by suggesting that Tsukamoto's self-described sensuous approach with Tetsuo resonates across the entire spectrum of the moving image evolution. The film's progressively arranged yet ultimately independent images channel the intentions and broken physicality of chronophotographic cells, flicker films, and the illusions conjured while peering into a spinning zoetrope. And its monochromatic film stock, 1.33:1 aspect ratio, expressive lighting, as well as its use of overriding music, uncannily resembles that of silent cinema. The film also plays with the stroboscopic textures of cafe robe tube television screens, mimicking in extremis the telescene process of transferring film to video, as well as subsequent signifiers of post-media artifacts that saw massive proliferation during the decade, such as the music video, video games, and particularly within Japan, anime. While the percussive and somewhat ancillary music of industrial musician Ishikawa Chu can be likened to the behaviour of silent film scores, it also provides uncanny links to the music video, as Ishikawa's collaboration with Tsukamoto involved him producing a batch of tracks of differing styles and tempos, with Tsukamoto selecting his favourites, leading to scenes being recut to better complement these choices, instead of the music being specially composed to accompany specific narrative beats. Although there are certainly similarities between Tetsuo and the aesthetics and themes of technology-obsessed anime texts of the period, I'd like to make the observation that Tsukamoto's brand of pixelation also tries to mimic some of their formal conventions, especially the ways in which animators of the era chose to depict the increasingly hyperbolic brawls of their characters in 80s anime series such as Fist of the North Star and Dragon Ball Z. And finally, the ways in which these characters are often anchored to a particular point in the frame during these fast-travelling sequences is redolent of the third-person perspective of video game syntax. Also, the strobing nature of Tsukamoto's stop-motion and the rapidly scrolling background environments can be likened to any number of arcade racing games available on the market at that time. One such example being Sega's Outrun from 1986, whose repetitious music and repeated sound effect samples also bear resemblance to the hyper-mechanical music and overdubbed soundscape of Tetsuo. Okay. Tsukamoto Shinya's Tetsuo the Iron Man represents a melting pot of medial mimesis, simultaneously borrowing, eluding, and subverting the signifiers of several image-based media. For its sequences of live-action stop-motion hybridity, it offers a fused, non-linear historiography of the animate and inanimate image that collapses their respective rationalities to construct new uncanny ones. This so-called medial uncanny, then, cannot exist without a prior sense of medial rationality, and this in itself is perhaps worthy of further investigation. But as a result of Tsukamoto's sensuous desire to explore the relationship between metal and the body, his spontaneous reflexivity also invites exploration between media and the body, as well as media and other media, and in doing so unexpectedly corrupts the rationale that we expectantly place upon them. Tetsuo then allows us to reflect without preconceived restraint on the fundamental nature of media signification in a way that feels both implicit and explicit, immediate and hypermediate, sensual and structural. Thank you.